Hey folks, if you enjoy stories about the people behind the technology that we use, you should check out the Greater Than Code podcast. They focus on the human side of software development with stories of diversity and inclusion, accessibility from people that you don't normally hear from. Search for Greater Than Code in your favorite podcast app or check out greaterthancode.com. Hi, this is Scott Hanselman, and this is another episode of Hansel Mints. Today I'm talking with Jina Anne. They're a design manager at Asana, founder of ClarityConf, chair of Design Tokens. You work at SAS, you're a Google Dev expert. You're doing all things design on the internet, and I'm thrilled to be chatting with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for hanging out. So, when I go and look at other people's worlds, whether it be people that code in a language that I'm not familiar with or people who live on a back-end system that I haven't used with, I start seeing terms and definitions that I don't understand. And since you're an expert on design and design systems specifically, I took a deep dive and I'm finding all kinds of things that I don't understand, and I want you to explain it to me. What is a design system?
It's really funny because the community has debates on how to define design systems. I like to tell people it's literally just design as a system. Like that's all there really is to it. But the reason it's hard to define is because they've evolved over the years. It used to just be like branding guidelines, logo placements, color palettes, typography styles. But then over the years, as digital products became super popular, now it also encompasses code standards, particularly around UI components, interaction guidelines, accessibility guidelines, voice and tone guidelines. Like there's so much to them now. So it's kind of become a lot of different things. But the way I like to say it is like it's really just being more systemic in the way that you design your UI or whatever it is that you're working on, particularly digital, because that's the world I'm in, but it's not always just digital either.
Mm-hmm. Does this apply to web apps specifically? Like here are the buttons, here are the groupings for buttons, and here's how that works. And I'm making a web application, and this defines the UX and the UI for the design. Or does it also apply for like a brochureware site or an actual design site that doesn't have interactivity? That is like, I'm going to add a page, and here's the language and the design system that I'm going to want to use.
So it can actually be both, and even real world experiences, like how you design navigating through a conference or, any sort of designed experience. But the most common context of design systems is around web products, specifically because they've become so complex with, most companies building software. They're usually doing a web application, maybe an Android application, an iOS application. And so, it can be, like buttons, tabs, anything that you interact with, essentially.
But I've heard the term pattern library, and I've heard style guide, and now we have design systems. Is it worth like parsing those out, or are they all the same thing?
I can kind of give you my point of view on it. So these are a lot of different artifacts that you're listing out. So a pattern library tends to be mostly around UI components. So like one of the earliest pattern libraries I can think of was the YUI library, which was Yahoo's library from, I don't even remember how long ago that was. But it was like the tabs, the buttons, the form elements, and all that. And so when people talk about a pattern library, it is usually documenting that. Style guide is a little bit more broad. Like I think style guide could be just writing style. If you're just thinking about the content perspective. In the branding and design world, it also would encompass color type, like I mentioned before, branding rules and guidelines around logo placement and so on. And design systems, I feel is like beyond that, like beyond the artifact, it also encompasses process. There's the people part of it, like how we work together, how we collaborate. And so it's kind of like a larger umbrella term. And so these artifacts can live in the world of design systems.
Okay. So I'm hearing you say that a style guide are like the rules for branding. Use the logo this way. It might even include like tone as far as like how we as a company want our prose, our color, our fonts all to be expressed. It doesn't necessarily say use a button this way, but it's like here's our sense of style. Then that scope expands, and then pattern libraries get into reusable assets, maybe UI, maybe buttons and things like that. And then a pattern library is much more cohesive.
Yeah, and I think some of this can be used interchangeably. I've seen people do a pattern library as part of their style guide. And, some people call style guides pattern libraries. So I think it's a little fuzzy, but for me, I look at style guide as documentation, like the how, where the pattern library is the what. Like these are the elements and pieces.
I've heard people say that in the early days of design on the web, there was a lot of kind of copy pasting so that someone would go and pull from a branding guideline or from a style guide and they'd paste in colors and they'd paste in UI elements. But a design system is differentiated by calling for the design in code. And then if the system changes, theoretically, you don't have to go and change everything by search and replace.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is why they really took off in the last 10 or so years is that traditional style guides, in fact, even like one of the earliest systems or like design systems slash style guide, whatever you want to call it at this point, was actually done in Quark. And it was just documenting the brand and documenting the color hex value and all that. And of course, that meant anytime we would make a change, you'd have to go back and edit the document or reflow things as you add new stuff. But with everyone moving towards putting their documentation online, it means you can actually tie it to real code. So if I want to update a color and I'm using a variable or a class for that color, then I update the color and it just automatically updated without having to go and keep that manually updated. And same thing with components, like anytime you want to update up what a button looks like and all its different interaction states, if you've got your design system and code in sync, then you make that change and it will roll out into your system rather than having to manually update it.
I remember that maybe 5 or 10 years ago, with things like Bootstrap, there was Bootstrap as a design system that was more structurally set up, and then there were skins or themes on top of them. Can design systems be made such that one could change the entire personality of a site just by swapping a variable or swapping a CSS page?
Oh, definitely. I think Bootstrap was probably what helped make this concept more prevalent and more accessible to more people. But yeah, so design tokens, which we can talk more about, is one part of design systems that a lot of design systems are adopting, which is a way to scale your design across your system. And it can be multiple platforms. And then you can very easily tweak colors, you can change sizing, you can change all that through that. And variables are a big part of how that works. You can also do it with just the variables, but yeah, design tokens are like how the community is kind of bringing it beyond just variables and thinking about other platforms as well.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like there's a large stack of technologies as well as agreements amongst designers on how to build something like this. Like my site is primarily using regular CSS, and it was really amazing and clean when I started. And then it slowly kind of rotted over the last several years as it's like, oh, I'm just going to add one more, selector. And now, honestly, I don't know anything. I just need to just start over. If I had done it correctly, though, it would be quite a bit more layered, wouldn't it, than just having CSS?
Well, it depends. I think there's still a use case for just vanilla CSS, and I don't see a problem with that. I think it's the larger, more web application centric design that tends to come with all these layers. Because usually, if you're using CSS preprocessors such as Sass, which CSS variables came out after Sass already had variables, so a lot of people were already using that to get that functionality. It just allows you to get additional abstractions in your CSS that you couldn't get with vanilla CSS. But now that there are CSS variables, that's no longer necessary. But you might still want to use other layers like Sass to get additional things like conditional loops and mix-ins, which is like repeatable code that you can use as patterns, if that makes sense. Do you want me to
Mhm.
describe that more?
Yeah, I think briefly having an understanding of mixins would be useful, because I think that a lot of the developers that are listening right now have an understanding of CSS like I do that is probably stuck in the early 2000s.
Yeah, so a lot of CSS preprocessors is basically a CSS like language that you write, but you get extra features, and then it'll compile to vanilla CSS. And so with Sass and many of the other preprocessors, you get functionality like mixins, which let's say uh, it's almost kind of like creating a class, but it's not going to output until you use it. And so you can give it a name, and you can like write the rules inside it. And anytime you call that mixin by its name, it'll repeat those rules. And what's nice about it is you can also create patterns with them where you maybe you have, let's say, background red, text color is white, and you have padding on it because you want it to be like this red box. And you find yourself using that red box in a few different places. So you can call that mixin and repeat that. And what's nice about with CSS preprocessors like Sass is you can make that red color, what they, you just turn that into a variable, and you can pass in a different color. So let's say I want a green box. Everything else about this green box is the same as the red box. So you can use that mixin, but then just change the color from red to green. So it gives you a lot of functionality to be able to do repeatable things while also allowing a little bit of flexibility. Of course, this is a very basic example. I probably wouldn't actually do a red box, green box, but just for example's sake, that's how it would work.
Well, I do think, though, that brings in the fundamental thing that has changed in CSS in the last 10 years, which is a recognition that things do get reused and then changed a tiny bit.
Yep.
And that's where I think CSS, HTML, separate from JavaScript, is really becoming a programming language. Like, I know that we have the whole argument about whether it's a markup language or a programming language, but once you include the concept of mixins, layering, methods and functions effectively that are nested, it's a functional language effectively.
Absolutely. And I'll just say I do see them as programming languages.
Yeah. And I think that this is a fundamental change in the way that I think that the devs like myself who were into CSS in the early 2000s, 2005, and then moved back into the back end and haven't spent as much time on the front end, have an older or aged perspective on how things are done on the front end.
Yeah. One thing I like to tell folks that maybe would do this type of thing more in JavaScript rather than CSS is it's basically taking some of that out of rendering in the browser, where the browser has to calculate those things. You're doing that beforehand, which is why it's a preprocessor. And so it can do that, compile the CSS, and then when you pull in that CSS into your website, all that logic's already been calculated pre-render. So it's kind of nice in like speed and performance, but yeah, it just, instead of making your browser do it.
Interesting. I don't know if it's a good analogy or not, but it almost seems like Sass and CSS preprocessors are kind of like TypeScript to JavaScript. It's giving you a lot more pre-calculation, pre-processing, also checking correctness, and it transpiles or expands into a larger, maybe a little harder to read CSS, but you don't need to worry about it because you only think about the pre-processed version.
Yes, absolutely.
Hey friends, I hope you're enjoying this podcast, and I hope you take a look at one of our sponsors, CBT Nuggets. CBT Nuggets is an IT training online system for professionals and anyone really looking to build IT skills. It's kind of like Netflix for IT people. They've got lots of great stuff, but their core specialties are networking, cloud, and security, and they're putting up 40 hours of new training each week. Their entire trainer team is 100% in-house. They're all active IT professionals with multiple certifications. One of the great things that CBT Nuggets has that a lot of other folks don't have are virtual labs. These are actually on-demand virtual environments that are tailored to the course material that you're taking. And it allows you to actually practice networking configs, do scripts, run queries alongside the course. Best of all, accountability coaching. It's really hard to go and self-learn, but this service is available to all learners with a subscription. They have a coaching team that's integrated with their trainer and their content team, so you can talk to a real person at CBT Nuggets who will help you craft a personalized learning plan, set goals, and they'll check in with you to keep you accountable. And they've got a great 7-day free trial where you're going to get unlimited access to their entire training library. The promo URL is cbtnuggets.com/Hansel-minutes. That's cbtnuggets.com/Hansel-minutes. So then we've got variables. We can use them in CSS preprocessors. We can have visual design properties like color, and we can store them in variables. So then I only have to say, pound FFF twice or once, and then I put it in a variable. Where do design tokens come in, and why aren't design tokens just variables?
Awesome question. Yeah. So for most people, at least when I look at a lot of design systems that use design tokens, it really is just variables, either in a CSS preprocessor or they're using CSS variables in vanilla CSS. But there are some companies that need to think beyond CSS. So like I mentioned before, maybe they're also scaling to Android, or they're scaling to iOS, or maybe they're doing charts which are driven through TypeScript and they need to calculate certain colors and things like that. There's all sorts of different stacks and things that like technology stacks that may or may not rely on just CSS variables or Sass variables or any other variable in CSS. So design tokens is a methodology that basically removes defining that directly in the CSS, and instead you would define it as data. And you can do that either as like JSON, or I tend to prefer YAML. I've also seen people even just do spreadsheets, but like wherever you prefer to store name and value pairs. And you can also give it additional metadata, which I can describe a little bit more in detail. But that then goes through a build process and converts to all the variables that you need for CSS. It might convert to XML for Android. It might convert to a JSON list that would be pulled in through an iOS app, or I think they use JSON, but and whatever format you need, it converts into that for you. And that way, what's great is like, if I have a brand that's across all these different platforms, and let's say one day I redesigned my brand and I went from a pink to a purple, instead of having to contact the Android team, the iOS team, the web team to tell them about this new color, I just change it in the design token. And then when they run a build, they get that new color automatically. And so it's a great way to scale design very quickly. And then you get extra features along with it of like scaling out themes like dark mode, or maybe you want to do a cozy, compact content density setting with spacing. And there's just all sorts of extra benefits you get by doing it through design tokens in a way that scales to all the platforms.
Interesting. That makes me think of one of my favorite brands, which is Waze. It's kind of like a better Google Maps GPS. They recently changed their very kind of unusual seafoam blue to a different, more friendly blue. And when I saw it happen, I was like, oh wow, the splash screen has changed and they've rebranded. And I'm not a designer, but I just had that experience. And I started thinking to myself, there was probably a meeting with a bunch of vice presidents, and everyone got around and they argued about changing from that blue to this blue. And somebody opened a Jira ticket and da-da-da-da-da. And 6 months later, the blue flowed down into the iOS application. So I'm hearing you say that design tokens and design system tokens are kind of not atoms, but even subatomic.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So that means it's like, here's the blue that we here at brand X have decided upon, and that blue and, these blues that are next to it, that's our blue. And then when a refresh happens, or we all change the font, like right now, Microsoft, I guess, is talking about changing the font for Word to a new font.
Ooh.
Then you wouldn't have to, they're like coming out with a whole new font. It's like a thing. They're voting on it. I'll get you in on the vote. Then that it flows through the system, because as a dev, I don't really care. I just want the thing to build.
Exactly. And I think that you really highlighted an important thing is like, if I'm the designer and I'm making a color change, why am I adding all this work onto if you're in an enterprise company, it could be like 20 different teams where I could just make that change and roll it out. And so obviously there's certain things that you need to involve the teams, but if I'm just making a color change, design tokens are a way for me to do that without adding more work on anybody else.
Interesting. Okay. So is this a tooling thing that I need to do, or is this an organizational willpower thing? Like, I just need to say to the organization, design tokens are where it's at, or is it a little of both?
It can be a little both because in most cases, you've probably already got a code base with colors and fonts and spacing already built. And so there would be that refactoring process of converting things to use the tokens. But there is tooling that helps with this. There's a tool called Theo, which we created when I used to work at Salesforce. It basically takes your data, as I mentioned before, and converts it to all the different platforms necessary that Salesforce cared about, and they open sourced it. And then Danny Banks at Amazon created a newer tool called Style Dictionary that's very, very popular. And it seems like a lot of the community is gravitating towards that tool. So it does a very similar thing of converting to what you need. And what's cool about tools like this, if they're built well, is they can take into account the platform context. So let's say I'm doing a transparent color in Android, I would have to do an 8-digit hex code. But if I'm doing that in CSS, I would be using like RGBA. And so it would make that type of conversion as well. And then a lot of new tools are getting created. Some some are not launched yet and some are in process, but I know the folks at Super Friendly are working on a GUI tool for making it a little bit more designer friendly, but it'll give you an UI to define your tokens, and it'll still generate the JSON in the background and then to all the platforms that you need. So there's a ton of tools out there now that try to make that conversion process easy. But then, there's still that part of if you already have things in your code base, you might have to refactor to now use the tokens. So that part still takes some human effort.
Yeah. You bring up a really interesting point. That's one of those things that you don't know that you need it until you need it. Recently, I spent a bunch of time manually copy pasting between RGB, red, green, blue, to HSL, hue, saturation, and lightness. And as I'm doing it kind of idly in the background, I'm like, part of my lizard brain is saying, computers can do these conversions for you. You're absolutely right. Some chief designer at the company should define these things. And it's an implementation detail of how it ends up being expressed in Android or iOS or whatever.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Then these design systems, though, are these limiting in some way? Are they kind of oppressive in the sense of like the design will become more stodgy and hard to change, or is it more liberating for the designer?
My personal take, and this does come up a lot, especially with very highly visual designers that love to be more creative, is whether or not design systems stifle creativity. And my personal take is they shouldn't actually stifle your creativity, but empower them, because rather than caring about, what border radius is my button, and, when that's already been defined in your system, you can now explore more like, what is this creative solution that my user is going to love that gets them from this task to this task quickly. So it lets you focus on the bigger picture thing rather than the tiny details that are, may be already systemized. So and I believe that not everything that you design needs to even come from the system, and not everything needs to go into the system. Like you obviously have the system there to let you do repeatable things very quickly, but you can still have areas in your product or your website that are maybe a highly editorialized creative splash that's not from the system, but it's still it's like a nice complement to your system. So it's just all about balance.
So getting into the tooling aspect of things, once you've decided as a company or as a group that you want to do this kind of things, I know about the basics like Sass and CSS, and I know that there are companies like Google and Microsoft that publish their style guides. and they
Mm-hmm.
publish their design systems. But then I go and find things like Stencil.js, which gets even more meta because it's a group of compilers that generates web components that builds apps, that builds design systems. I mean, can you explain what that is and what a tool chain for design systems are? And is that just one of many?
It's definitely one of many. So, web components has been very interesting in the design system space because it's basically creating these components as like, I think the best way I can describe it is like it's a one-off object that can live on your page. And
Mm-hmm.
so it decouples the so I was brought up with the Cascade. I love the Cascade, but web components are very different. It's almost like, yeah, a stencil that you just drop into your page and it's fully encapsulated. It's
Mm-hmm.
interesting because it usually means it's more protected. Like there's no chance of something further up the cascade that can break it. At least that's the idea behind it. And Stencil.js, from what I understand, is basically an open source library that tries to make that easier because they've already created a bunch of patterns using web components. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it has like, what's the word they use for like when it's not something available in your browser yet, but there's a word for it. It's like
Polyfill?
polyfill.
Polyfill?
Thank you. Like I believe it
Right.
might have some of that built into it, so you can take advantage of that style of building, even if not everything supports that yet.
Okay, so let me say something back to you to make sure that I'm still following.
Yeah.
So when I came up in 20 years ago in HTML, if I made a Scott element, you
Mm-hmm.
know, open, less than Scott, closed, greater than, it would not render because it is an unknown element. It's a span that's not named. It doesn't do
Right.
anything. Okay, so then a web component could allow me to create a custom element so that Scott would actually have essence, would have a
Yes.
real behavior. And a web component could have behavior and then it could have look and feel. It could become a calendar or a
Mm-hmm.
accordion or whatever. So custom elements is taking what I thought was a tag that is a no-op
Mm-hmm.
and giving it life.
Yeah. And I'll admit I've personally not used them, but I've been
Mm-hmm.
excited by seeing what people have done with them. Um,
Mm.
and there's a lot of things that you see commonly in web applications that aren't custom HTML elements. And it's like at this point, why aren't they? Because you keep seeing these same patterns like date pickers or,
Mm.
you know, I'm blanking on an example right now, but all these common things that you interact with all the time. It's like, well, let's create a library that would work across all our different browsers. And so I think that was the goal behind it. And then I have seen people explore pairing things like design tokens and web components together. I think that's what the team that I used to be on at Salesforce have moved towards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so things are definitely getting interesting for sure.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like something like a web component, and I'm speaking again from a place of ignorance, that describes how something is structured and how something
Mm-hmm.
behaves could be combined with a design system where I'll be the dev and I'll worry about how it moves and what clicks do what, and you'll
Right.
make it look nice, and
Yeah.
both of us can change things, and that's a really nice model view controller kind of a vibe.
Yeah, definitely. And then, yeah, if I decide to change the shadow on something, I don't even need to bug you about it. I can just do it.
That's awesome. So then, okay, I've not had an opportunity to talk to a whole lot of designers, so I actually wanted to ask a couple of like rapid fire lightning round questions. Why do we need visual refreshes? Like me as a design person, like I know that like not as a non-design person, I like this kind of looks old. And then I'll show up to the website and then it won't look old. Like Gmail will look different or Office looks
Mhm.
different. Why do designers decide we need a new font? We need a new color. All these icons suck. They were fine a minute ago. What happened?
um, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a subjective thing, but I think when you keep your brand fresh, you want your UI to also feel fresh. I think you see like these, I almost want to call them like eras in visual design where it's like,
Mm,
I think back to the Web 2.0 days where everything was bubbly and glossy and shiny. And then, everything kind of went flat and almost like far extreme into flat. And now, if you look at like more of the recent stuff from Apple and Google, you'll see like they're bringing some of that depth back in, and not as far as Web 2.0 was, but making things look
Yeah.
a little bit more tactile. And so I think there's the whole industry trend thing of following that. But then if you're a company like that where you're setting that trend, like keeping things fresh, it just, I don't know, it just gets people to see like, oh, okay, this isn't stale, this isn't stagnant. Like there's, constant improvement with this.
It feels like it really is like fashion, where it's
It
like
is.
we look back 20 years and we're like, oh man, these pants they were the best back then, but I would never think about wearing those pants today.
The only one I hope doesn't come back is I remember the super tiny pixel size fonts, which was super popular with Flash websites. Like now with a focus on accessibility and inclusion, which I think is amazing. I don't think we're going to get back to that point, and I hope we never do.
Yeah. The thing that I hope never comes back, and I remember thinking it was the greatest thing ever, was the like 3-dimensional shelves with actual wood, kind of skeuomorphic. Like,
yeah.
look, like imagine Netflix, but designed skeuomorphically, where it's like a 3D rendered shelf with like your actual VHS tapes on the shelf.
It's so funny because I've not seen that come back with web, but I did see a photo recently from an Apple store, like in-person Apple store, where they designed the backdrops to look like a wooden shelf so it's like almost like skeuomorphism, but for print and real world, it's so meta.
It is a little bit meta. Skeuomorphs, just for those that may not understand, it's kind of a style of ornamental design that looks very much like evocative of the real world, right? So like real shelves and real tables and real textures and things like that.
Yeah.
But a button with a button with a granite tile background maybe wouldn't fly today.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Jina Anne, for chatting with me today.
Yeah, no problem. This was fun.
You can find Jina on Twitter and at jina.design. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.